Welcome to this quiet corner of retold wonders, where embers glow like drowsy fireflies and familiar tales breathe anew. If you feel inclined, whisper in the comments where your own night or morning unfolds. Every flicker of presence gathers about this hearth like another friendly spark. Dusk settles over the borderland between field and forest, where weather-worn cottage leans politely toward the trees. Its roof of moss-soft thatch drinks in the violet of the sky, and a chimney exhales pale ribbons of wood smoke that drift, linger and dissolve among the first shy stars. Beneath that roof, firelight wavers across rough-hewn timbers, painting warm ribbons on stone and straw, on pewter kettle and patched cushion, on bone-white flour scattered like frost across the low kitchen table. The hearth is the heart of the room, cradling a quiet burn that snaps only when a log settles deeper into red gold coals. No one speaks, yet a lullaby seems to hum through everything, the hush of turning season, the distant chirr of crickets, the patient pulse of the flame. Cinderella moves within this glow as gently as moonlight pouring through shutters. Her linen gown, faded to the blue of well-loved sky, carries a constellation of flower and ash. Her apron is stitched and rest-stitched with thread as early dawn. She is sweeping the flagstones in broad, slow crescents, careful not to raise a clatter. Each stroke gathers the day's dust crumbs of loam from muddy shoes, stray petals shaken free of wild bouquets, and the thread-like shadows of soot that slide from the chimney whenever wind sighs down the flue. The broom's bristles whisper, a softer echo of the wind outside. Her chores began long before the sun's rim brushed the hills. First came the hens. She coaxed them from roost to yard with a rustling of grain, soothing their feathered fretfulness with quiet murmurs where she knelt among dew-wet leaves to free seedlings from encroaching weeds, fingers cool and earth-scented. A trip to the well followed, 2 buckets wobbling at the ends of a yoke across her shoulders. The water's surface caught the broadening morning like polished glass. Laundry flapped on the line until clouds shouldered in. She snatched it down just as the first shy raindrops began, draping linens before the hearth to dry. All this she did without complaint, with scarcely a sound save the occasional humming of a tune too small for memory, yet too sweet to forget. Now twilight rests its head upon the windowsill. Cinderella folds a coarse cloth and sets it atop a neat stack of others, alignment square, corners precise. She straightens, presses the small of her back, and allows herself a measured breath. In that brief stillness, a soft presence stirs. A tiny mouse, whiskers a-quiver, peeps from behind a jug. Its fur is the color of morning fog, its eyes twin beads of onyx polished by starlight. Cinderella lowers one hand, palm open, neither beckoning nor commanding. The creature edges forward, bold and shy at once, to brush her fingertip with a quick, grateful nose. She smiles, and the smile seems to belong to the room as naturally as the fire belongs to the hearth. Beyond the cottage door, the village exults in fresh rumour. Only hours ago a company of royal heralds clattered through the muddied main road, trumpets gleaming like jars of captured sunrise. They unfurled a scroll, sealed with wax, the deep carmine of autumn roses, and read, in voices brimming with practiced ceremony, a decree from the palace. In 1 month's time, the kingdom shall host a grand ball, where every maiden of suitable age may present herself before Prince Rowan, that he might learn the breadth of his people and perchance discover a partner of kindred spirit. Children repeated them as rhymes, market stalls buzzed like hives. By afternoon, a copy of the decree was pinned to the great oak in the square, its edges fluttering in the breeze like the wings of some rare moth. Cinderella heard the announcement while carrying a parcel of mended linens to the baker's wife. She paused among the crowd, felt her heart flutter at the idea of candlelit halls and music curling through marble colonnades, and then let the thought settle, like confetti drifting to ground. Beautiful, yes, yet distant palace floors are polished bright enough to mirror elegant shoes, not soles darkened by ash. She quietly wished the prince good fortune in his search, and returned to her errands before anyone could see longing kindle in her gaze. Inside the cottage, a low shelf cradles a lumpy earthen jar, nothing remarkable at first glance. Yet when the fire bends forward on a gust that slips down the chimney throat, the jar's glaze acquires a fleeting shimmer, thin as a dream's edge. No spell breaks forth, no trumpets of enchantment resound. Only a hush deepens, the kind that arrives when unseen eyes open in kindly surveillance. A single candle, stubby and near its end, flares with sudden steadiness, as though a hand the colour of moonbeams shielded it from draught. Cinderella does not notice, or perhaps she chooses not to. Sometimes, when tasks press close and hope feels expensive, it is enough simply to let wonder survive unspoken. She ladles stew from iron pot into a wooden bowl, sets it on a small table by the hearth, and places beside it a crust of bread, rough cut but fragrant. She does not yet eat. First, she slips through the back door into the breath of evening. The orchard beyond the cottage is slim and scattered only 5 trees, but tonight their leaves flutter silver green in the half-light, rattling softly like coins in a velvet pouch. She gathers fallen twigs for kindling, her basket filling with the sweet resinous scent of apple bark. The moon, still low, peers between branches and splinters into pale fragments across her shoulders. In the distance the castle rises, a silhouette of quiet grandeur outlined in pearl against deepening indigo. From its highest tower a bell strikes the hour, measured, unhurried, each tone dissolving before the next arrives. Sound travels slower at night. By the time the bell's 9th chime finds the cottage, it has thinned into something like a sigh. Cinderella tilts her head, listening not only to the bell, but to the spaces between. Somewhere inside those spaces lie possibilities yet unnamed. Returning indoors, she nudges the fire, adds 2 of her orchard twigs, and watches sparks waltz upward, vanish. At last she sits, spoon in hand. Steam coils from the stew, catching faint traces of marjoram and thyme she picked at noon. With each bite warmth spreads through her chest, soft as flannel, yet her mind wanders. She imagines long windows draped in velvet the color of midnight lakes, mirrored floors that reflect chandeliers like star clusters, gowns fashioned from whispers of mist. She thinks of dancing, of laughter that does not weigh itself first, of a moment when ash and splendor share the same breath, and in that imagining the room listens. The mouse joined now by another, smaller still perches at her boot. She breaks a breadcrumb, lays it gently before them, and murmurs a thanks so quiet it is felt more than heard. The fire dips, flares, subsides. Outside, wind roams through the lane, carrying fragrance of wet earth and distant chimney smoke to harvest dreams from every window ledge. A hush gathers, not the hush of emptiness but of expectation, as though the ordinary air has begun sewing together fine invisible threads. Perhaps the broom will sweep of its own accord tomorrow. Perhaps a pumpkin in the garden has been drinking moonlight for reasons it does not yet understand. Perhaps the bell on the castle tower, when it next tolls, will strike not only the hour but the fragile glass wall between what is and what might be. All remains quiet for now. Quiet is, after all, how most enchantments begin, like a seed folded deep in soil. Content to wait for the precise persuasion of rain, Cinderella stirs the last of the stew, sets bowl aside, and withdraws a worn volume of fables from a nearby shelf. She opens to a random page, though she knows each story by heart, and lets her gaze brush the faded ink. A sentence rises. Kindness is its own form of magic, and drifts across her mind like a swan gliding where river meets mist. It closes the book, presses its cover to her breast, and allows the sentence to echo in her bones. When she drifts to her straw-stuffed mattress tucked beneath the rafters, moonlight slips through the shutter slats, threading silver ribbons across her pillow. The cottage settles, timbers giving tiny cracks of relief, pots muttering faint metallic sighs as they cool. Somewhere, a cricket begins a patient serenade, another answers. The duet unfurls until the night itself seems to hum in harmony. Cinderella's breathing joins the secret orchestra slow, measured, sprung from a hope both fragile and unbreakable. In the hearth, a single coal retains its glow, like the quiet eye of some ancient guardian. The coal pulses once, twice, and on the third pulse, a mote of amber light detaches and drifts upward, though no breeze conducts it. It lingers above the embers, a miniature sun suspended in reverie, then winks out without ash or smoke. One might call it coincidence. One might call it the smallest announcement of something gracious on the wing. Night deepens. The village settles into its pocket of valley darkness, and the castle on the distant knoll lifts its towers into a sky trembling with constellations. Somewhere within those high walls, musicians rehearse a slow waltz, the notes travelling braided corridors toward the future. Somewhere within the garden behind the cottage, a vine coils a fraction farther than yesterday, its tendril curling like a question mark offered to the stars. Everything waits. Everything listens. Thus the prologue draws its final breath. A half in twilight, A girl with hands gentle enough for mice and strong enough for scrubbing brushes, a royal decree fluttering against an ancient oak, and the faintest shimmer of spellcraft hidden within ordinary lamplight. Tomorrow will bring another dawn, another list of tasks, another ripple of rumor about silk gowns and palace chandeliers. Yet for now, in this soft hour between what has finished and what has not yet begun, Cinderella sleeps, and the world cottage, village, forest, castle leans closer, as though to keep safe the quiet dream that might, with patience, change everything. Before the embers of the previous night had wholly sighed themselves to sleep, a dove-grey dawn seeped across the thatched rooftops, stroking the chimney pots with tentative light. Beneath that waking sky, the little kitchen where Ella kept her quiet vigil exhaled the last breath of its hearth fire, a faint orange glow hidden under a crust of ash. She rose from her pallet beside the hearthstones, as though summoned by that tremulous shimmer, brushing soot from her sleeve while the house remained hushed and half-dreaming. Outside, dew silvered the herb garden, clinging to sage and thyme like minute lanterns. She unlatched the scullery door without letting it creak, and cool air flooded over her bare arms, smelling faintly of wet earth and milkweed. The copper pails waited by the well. She balanced one on each hip, feet remembering every loose stone of the path. When the rope groaned its sleepy circle, water rose dark and mirror smooth, catching a reflection of her face softened by early light, eyes still holding splinters of the night's quiescent stars. Back within, the household began its muted stirrings. Stepmother Severine seldom descended before the hearth clock chimed 9, yet her presence drifted everywhere like unspoken expectation. Ella laid the breakfast cloth of pale damask, aligning jasmine embroidery with the table's edge. She warmed yesterday's loaf, sliced ripe pears, and poured dark coffee so its fragrance would greet the ladies gently. Her motions, practiced and modest, were precise, as though she stitched time itself into hidden seams. The stepsisters arrived first, Arnelle rubbing sleep from her eyes with an embroidered sleeve, Brigitte already examining her reflection in a silver spoon. They murmured thanks that sounded almost accidental, yet Ella tucked those syllables away like seed pearls, evidence that courtesy had not fully deserted the manor. While they ate, she tended the fire, adding birch logs whose bark released a faint wintergreen perfume. Sparks ascended, delicate and deliberate, echoing her own wish to rise, though she kept that wish folded, unspoken, inside the pocket of her apron. Around the hearthstone lived a parliament of mice, grey secrets with bright bead eyes. They emerged, trusting her quiet ways, to gather stray crumbs and pear seeds. She scattered a few extra morsels behind the brass coal scuttle, where the cats never ventured, and in return the mice offered squeaks that suggested gratitude. Beside them, almost invisible in the flicker, perched 2 cinder sprites, soot-smudged creatures no higher than her thumb. They bowed solemnly as she straightened a fallen broom, then vanished in a faint twirl of ember dust. Mid-morning light painted roaming squares across the flagged kitchen floor. Ella followed them in her cleaning, polishing copper pans until they caught each slow-moving sunbeam and sent it wandering anew. From the corridor drifted the sisters' voices, Brigitte sounding like fractured crystal when she laughed, Arnelle lower, almost kind when she forgot herself. Their conversation orbited fabrics and caught musicians, but every so often a silence fluttered in, revealing how little certainty lay beneath their satin chatter. Even Severine, passing the doorway, seemed to pause, fingertips grazing a panel of oak, as though testing its steadiness. When the sun reached its meridian and hummed in the windows with a honeyed glow, Ella carried luncheon to the shaded veranda. Vines of wisteria dangled lavender tassels. Trading perfume with the gentle breeze, she lingered a heartbeat, letting colour and scent settle into her memory like pigments into wet plaster. Then the bell above the stairwell chimed, the softest summons. She returned inside to mend a torn hem on Arnelle's riding gown. Needle, thread, cloth, breath each, metronomic repetition, soothed her more surely than any lullaby. Severine observed the mending from the writing desk, quill poised above an ivory sheet. Her expression, as always, was difficult to read. Poised, attentive, never overtly cruel. There were days she invited Ella to taste a rare tea, or asked, almost gently, whether the girl had slept well, yet the kindness remained brittle, ready to fracture if challenged, and so Ella answered politely, eyes lowered, grateful for neutral ground. She understood that grief had chiseled deep chambers in Severine's heart. Cruelty sometimes grew where sorrow could not find water. Late afternoon found the sisters in the solar, practicing a minuet under the tutelage of a traveling music master. From the corridor, Ella could hear the click of Brigitte's slippers, the uncertain pause of Arnell's step, and the patient pluck of a theorbo marking time. She delivered fresh kerchiefs and a pitcher of lemon water. Receiving a flushed smile from Arnell, a distracted nod from Brigitte, and a courteous inclination from the maestro, whose eyes suggested he knew a tired servant when he saw one. Then she withdrew, leaving ambition and instruction to swirl behind her like dust in sunlit rooms. The day's weight settled gradually upon her shoulders, yet inside a different realm stirred. Whenever Ella paused between scrubbing a stair and trimming a rosebush, phantom melodies brushed her thoughts, fragments of a dance she had never learned, glimpses of a life unshadowed by soot. In those small intervals, she imagined her mother's voice humming an evening hymn, her father's laugh echoing through open stable doors. Dreams, however gentle, were contraband in the strict economy of labor. She folded them away like contraband letters, but they glimmered through the seams. When twilight lapped against the windows, Ella knelt to stir the hearth one last time. Cinders breathed scarlet for a moment, illuminating her hands and the downy moth that fluttered between shadows. She whispered a wish for the moth to find its moon, and opened the small casement so it might drift outward on dusk's mild current. Behind her, Severine's slippers halted upon the threshold. The stepmother said nothing, only watched the moth disappear, then nodded, as though acknowledging a courtesy paid to the fragile and nameless. Supper unfolded in murmured civility. Candles, newly lit, burned with steady patience, their flames reflecting in polished silver like twin rows of little suns. Ella served broth scented with bay leaf, carried in platters of roasted roots, and refilled goblets from a jug of well water chilled with river stones, sharing a bit of carrot with the oldest mouse, who dared to rest his paws on her wrist before scampering into the cracks. Such fleeting trust tasted sweeter than cinnamon. The hour of lamplighting drew her to the stables, where the gentle mare Apple Blossom whickered at her approach. Ella stroked the velvet muzzle, combed through a mane tangled by afternoon breezes, and sang a fragment of an old lullaby the animal seemed to remember. In the loft above, swallows nested, their faint cheeps filtering through hay-scented air. She gathered fresh straw for bedding, leaving a saucer of oats sprinkled with dried blueberry for the barn sprites, whose tiny silhouette she glimpsed skittering among beams. Night thickened, but chores remained. Shutters to close, wick trimmers to pinch, ledgers to stack. Ella moved through corridors, muffled with velvet drapes, guided by memory more than light. On a marble console outside the music room, she replaced a fallen camellia blossom in its glass bowl, fingers lingering on the cool petals. She wondered, not for the first time, how something so delicate could bear such silence. Likewise, she bore her days fragile in appearance, unwavering in endurance, pale yet pulsing with unseen life. It was near this quiet hour that the courier arrived, unseen by Ella, though his shadow brushed the foyer like a passing cloud. Severin accepted a sealed parchment bearing the royal crest, a moon-white swan afloat upon midnight blue. Its wax impressed her fingertips with cool authority. Upstairs, doors whispered, footsteps converged, excitement muffled by decorum. Ella noticed only the faint tremor in the air, as if the house itself was pausing for breath. A letter, she guessed, yet its destination and import remained veiled. Shared, she twirled once, letting her skirt below, then pressed a finger to her lips. News? She breathed, scarcely louder than the drip of water from the rinsing board. Ella paused, cloth in hand, and in that hush she felt the floor tilt, as though the world were about to reveal a hidden stairway. But Arnell only giggled, gathered her hems, and hurried out, leaving a faint scent of rose pomade in her wake. Long after footsteps faded, Ella stayed among the linens, fingertips resting on damask still warm from the iron. She pictured news ground enough to drift through every corridor, to lift even Severine's guarded eyes. A royal summons, perhaps? The idea felt impossible, like snow in harvest time. Yet a shiver moved within her. Hope, slender as a candle flame in draught, stubbornly bright. She let it settle, neither fed nor quenched, then returned to folding. Somewhere beyond the sleeping orchard, church bells rehearsed distant chords, hinting at forthcoming revelries the kingdom would soon proclaim beneath soft widening starlight. Night had drifted gently into pale morning, and the last orange embers that had murmured in the scullery grate were now merely a remembering warmth beneath grey ash. Upon that fading glow, the story breathed anew, as though the hush of soot and cinder still curled around the quiet figure who had listened to its comfort. Dawn, shy and pearl-tinted, pressed soft fingers against the window panes, and the household, the great, many-chambered house that once belonged to a kindly merchant, stirred like a heavy manuscript being opened to its next fragile page. From the courtyard beyond the ivy-scrolled arch, the muted roll of cartwheels announced visitors. Plodding hooves kept a soporific cadence, and bright pennants drooped in the mellow light, their amethyst and amber threads hardly daring to flutter. Royal heralds, clad in velvet dyed the deep blue of cornflowers at dusk, dismounted with practiced grace. They carried scrolls rimmed in wax and threaded with gold cords, yet even their important burden could not disturb the languid dawn. They spoke in measured undertones, as though the very announcement they bore wished to drift like perfume rather than ring like bells. In the grand hall their voices pooled beneath the rafters, murmuring of a forthcoming ball, a celebration decreed by the young prince in honor of his approaching name day. Statutes were cited, dates pronounced, but every syllable slid across polished oak like a feather across still water. Staff and serving maids listened with wide eyes. Even the tapestry seemed to lean closer, their woven huntsmen forgetting the chase to attend this quieter spectacle. Eventually the head herald affixed the parchment to the notice board, his wax seal settling with a sigh, instead of a snap, and the delegation withdrew, leaving expectation floating like dust in sunbeams. Word wafted upward, through the warren of corridors and up the curling staircase to the chamber shared by Drusilla and Petronella, the merchant's elder daughters by marriage. There, amid a fluster of ribbons already strewn from yesterday's preoccupations, excitement rustled awake, slippers thumped upon floorboards, drawers yawned open, and a small avalanche of crumpled muslin tumbled forth. Yet even their haste carried a strangely muffled quality, as though the very walls asked them to tread softly upon the edges of dream. The sisters complied only half-consciously, voices dropping to breathy conspiracies, while hands measured fabric against impatient hearts. Bolts of silk were summoned from the cedar chests, a springtime spectrum of rose mist, willow green, and the pale butter shade that lives only in the first narcissus, pooling like still ponds under moonlight. Spindly corset bones, strings of freshwater pearls, and scintillating sequins were laid out in patient rows, each shiny trinket promising applause yet making no sound at all. The sisters lingered over these treasures, their laughter subdued, their quarrels hushed, for even rivalry felt lulled by the gentle hush that companioned the impending ball. Beyond their door, a corridor niche became a hive for whispering companions who drifted in to trade scraps of rumor like silk moths, exchanging secret powder from their wings. Courtiers' daughters from neighboring manor houses, a seamstress's shy apprentice, even the butler's nephew stopping with a tray each, added subtle threads to the tapestry of gossip. Would the prince dance with every maiden? Would betrothal bloom beneath chandeliers? The questions fluttered but never fully flew. They perched on half-formed syllables, too drowsy to echo. Only the clock, ticking like a distant lake lapping a pier, kept steady count of the slowly widening wonder. On the lower landing, Cinderella paused with her basket of laundered linens, eyes lifting as though she could see straight through ceilings and floors to that nimbus of gathering anticipation. A faint smile tiptoed across her lips. Not envy, not quite yearning, simply a recognition of something bright weaving itself through the house, something lighter than shores and kinder than memory. She did not linger. Linens awaited folding, mending awaited thread. Yet each step she took along the familiar flagstones seemed to carry a new, tremulous resonance, a secret chord struck in the quiet heart of an ordinary afternoon. That resonance summoned another, an older, softer vibration held deep inside her thoughts. Long ago, before the merchant had journeyed to the far harbours and never returned, before the second marriage and the rearranging of bedrooms and boundaries, there had been evenings when her mother hummed gentle songs while candlelight stitched gold filaments through simple cloth. The memory glowed now, not as a wound, but as a window. Through it poured the scent of lavender, kept with needlework, and the mild thrill of watching plain fabric slowly blossom beneath careful fingers into something meant for celebration. A sigh almost imperceptible left her as she climbed to the garret, where her own possessions dwelt in modest silence. Beneath the angled roof, dust motes drifted like drowsy fireflies, and a single trunk waited by the wall. Its lock was old and obliging, the lid lifted with a pliant creak no louder than the turning of a page. Inside lay folded remnants of another time, a gown the colour of early dawn, stitched by her mother for a festival that was never attended, its bodice embroidered with tiny silver leaves that now flickered like moonbeams in shade. She drew the garment free, letting it from a long sleep rather than disturbing stored cloth. The satin still whispered, a near-silent rustle reminiscent of breeze through budding orchards. Against her rough work dress, the fabric was impossibly gentle. Against her skin it felt like remembering spring while standing in winter. For one slow moment she raised the gown before her, imagining lamplight pooling upon its folds, imagining music swelling in spacious halls, imagining quite simply belonging among people who spoke to her by name rather than by necessity. The attic stair groaned, not harshly but with the polite warning of an aged servant, and the stepmother appeared, velvet slippers sinking softly into dust. Attired in subdued burgundy and holding a lace handkerchief, she surveyed the scene with eyes neither warm nor cold eyes practiced in appraisal. Her voice descended like falling snow, light yet absolute. There would, she observed, be much to accomplish before any members of this household could contemplate attendance at court. Floors required scrubbing, tapestries beating, lace edging restored, and if, by some unlikely twist, the work concluded, duties could be found elsewhere. A pause, weightless yet inexorable, followed. Her gaze settled upon the dawn-coloured gown, and the faintest curve of a smile traced her lips something neither approval nor disdain, merely a calculated acknowledgement of hierarchy. She spoke not in threats but in velvet-lined certainties. The invitation, though publicly inclusive, must first heed propriety. Propriety, she implied, favoured presentation, polish, pedigree. With gentle diction, she reminded the girl of soot smudges yet to be erased and errands yet to be run. If in the hush that remained afterward, the gown wished again to breathe, it must wait in the chest until duties no longer breathed themselves. The stepmother withdrew, footsteps fading like petals falling onto moss, and quiet collected once more in the garret. Cinderella held the gown, fingers smoothing one silken panel, then folded it tenderly, and replaced it in the trunk. But she did not close the lid entirely. A ribbon of dawnlight slipped through the eaves and lay across the fabric, like a promise holding its breath. In her chest another ribbon stirred thin, luminous, resistant to measured decrees. She gathered laundry in lists, ready to meet the hours, yet somewhere behind her eyes the distant ballroom already shimmered with possibility. Downstairs, the house unfurled into afternoon. Copper kettles gleamed beneath slow-moving sunbeams, and garden shadows lengthened across stone paths where marigolds nodded. The stir of preparations continued, Drusilla practicing a curtsy before a gilt mirror, Petronella experimenting with powdered roses to tint her cheeks, servants exchanging pins and patterns. Threads of excitement mingled with threads of doubt, weaving a fabric too complex for anyone to name. Through an open window drifted the mellow fragrance of wild thyme, carrying with it the distant rumble of a travelling peddler's cart, a gentle reminder that roads reached beyond fences and nights beyond shores. Evening would arrive by and by, bringing with it the muted glow of first stars and the slow turning of keyholes toward rest. Somewhere beyond forests and meadows, a palace orchestra tuned its violins, though the sound was only imagined here, like a candle not yet lit. For now, time drifted in amber suspension, balancing between decree and dream. And in that balance, fragile yet enduring, the quiet ember of hope began to breathe more steadily ready, when twilight deepened, to meet a different kind of magic that waited, patient as starlight, just beyond the garden wall. Crickets would soon stitch their silver rhythm into the hush, and fireflies, like floating ellipses, would softly punctuate the paths, guiding every lingering thought toward the mellow promise of approaching midnight. Embers dwindled to ruby pinpoints as the household surrendered to evening quiet, and in that tawny glow Cinderella had pressed the last washcloth smooth, hearing only the small tick that concluded the kitchen clock's slow circuit. With the murmuring hearth fading behind her, she had climbed the narrow service stairs, candle cupped in one hand, mind lingering on the lullaby of settling timbers. Now dawn filters in, pale as breath upon glass, coaxing her eyes open to the cedar-sweet solitude of the garret. Yesterday's promise, that hidden memories sometimes wait where silence's deepest hovers like a half-remembered chord. The morning breeze nudges the dormer window, stirring motes that drift like sleepy fireflies above weathered rafters. Guided by that whispering current, Her gaze lands upon an oaken trunk, nested between forgotten hat boxes and a once polished harp, stripped of strings. The trunk's brass lock is tarnished but unlatched, as though waiting for hands that remember the pattern of its grain. Kneeling, she traces a fingertip over initials her mother carved years before, a looping C that mirrors her own name, and a hush deeper than dust settles around her while she lifts the lid. A hush of lavender sachets unfurls, carrying the fragrance of summer's long folded away. Inside lies a gown the colour of moonlit lilies, fabric dulled by time yet shimmering faintly where threads of silver still catch the light. One sleeve has loosened, and a hem has frayed, but the bodice is ghosted with memories of gentle laughter, orchard dances, and the warmth of arms that once guided small steps across parquet floors. Running the material across her cheek, she feels again the soft rustle of her mother's skirts, and she knows the gown has been waiting for this moment of remembrance. She lays the garment across the attic cot and smooths each crease as though ironing sunrise across a still pond. From the sewing box its lid, the mosaic of mismatched buttons sashed. She gathers needles, silk strands, and tiny spools whose colours echo dawn. Each tool was once her mother's, polished smooth by patient evenings, filled with stories of hope stitched between seams. Sitting cross-legged, she whispers those tales back into the quiet, letting the words weave with the dust until memory feels tangible, a tapestry suspended in the hushed air of rafters and beams. The first stitch is almost a sigh, thread gliding through weary cloth with grateful ease. She reinforces a shoulder where time had thinned the weave, then turns the skirt, guiding the needle through delicate pleats. Hours spiral softly, marked only by the shadow of the air, window pane inching across floorboards. Outside, doves murmur over the eaves, lending the work a lullaby rhythm, and within, her breath keeps tempo. Inhale, gather, exhale, release until the gown begins to glow, humble yet hopeful, under the candle of noon. A soft scritch announces small companions. From a crack beneath the cedar chest emerges a trio of mice, coats the shade of toasted oats, whiskers quivering with unspoken courtesy. They carry lengths of thread twice their size, dragging them like banners of quiet celebration. Unafraid, they scamper to her side, arranging the strands in tidy coils, and then, with tiny teeth, nip away loose ends she cannot see. Their delicate industry feels like laughter in miniature, and she thanks them with a smile warm enough to gild the dusty beams with golden hush. As afternoon light turns honey deep, wings flutter against the sill, 2 finches alight, heads cocked in delicate inquiry. When the window is gently propped open, they swoop inside, trailing sunlit arcs before settling atop the trunk. With careful beaks they gather fallen feathers pale, soft, almost weightless, and offer them up as padding for worn seams. The mice chirrup approval, and soon a quiet congress forms. Paws passing pins, beaks adjusting ribbon, fingers guiding fabric. No voice rises above the murmur of cloth, yet an unspoken chorus of cooperation fills the room with serenity. Time loosens its strict lines, unfurling into a tender montage. Silken strands spool and unspool beneath steady hands. Tiny paws pat down new hem tape. Wings beat small currents that help the fabric dry where a fresh wash of lavender water has cleaned the age from its folds. The gown seems to awaken, its pearlescent sheen returning like moonlight on a calm lake. With each stitch, each gentle tug, she feels threads of present and past entwine, binding loss to possibility, sorrow to song. By twilight, the gown stands transformed still simple, yet luminous with quiet dignity. Tired eyes half close, and the attic shifts into dream space. Candle flame elongates, becoming chandeliers of crystal, and faded floorboards stretch into a marbled ballroom polished to mirror perfection. In this drifting reverie she steps forward, gown swirling around her ankles in a soft tide, music slow, stringed, shimmering seems to bloom from the very walls, guiding her through waltz patterns she somehow remembers. She turns, and echoing steps draw nearer until a tall figure, face gentled by lamplight, extends a gloved hand. No name is spoken. Instead, the hush between heartbeats carries every needed promise. Round and round they glide while invisible drapery breathes above. Each rotation light is down. She senses in him not only princely bearing, but also the quiet ache of someone who has searched, long and late, for understanding. Their eyes meet like dawn touching water, and though the vision is but spun sugar of the mind, it flavors the attic air with delicate sweetness. She hears herself laugh, the sound bright yet unstartling, and that single note sends ripples of confidence through waking and dreaming alike, convincing her that perhaps the dance waits somewhere beyond the boundaries of night. The waltz fades as the candle gutters, drawing her gently back. She stands before the completed gown, its restored ribbons lying like captured twilight against milk-pale silk. Gratefully she drapes it over a wooden dress form, smoothing the bodice one last time. The mice curl within a spool box, whiskers tucked, contented dreams already beginning. The finches slip into the outside dusk, wing beats as soft as closing pages. Alone once more, she sets her thimble beside the needle cushion and descends the stairwell, heart buoyed by the quiet certainty that tomorrow will carry the promise of music. Dawn arrives, clad in pearl-grey mist, brushing cool fingers across the rooftops. In the attic, she wakes early, curiosity humming like a small harp inside the chest. Determined to greet the household's bustle with steady grace, she bathes her face in a bowl of rainwater caught overnight, then turns to the dress form where the restored gown waits in drowsy elegance. Candlelight has surrendered to a tapering shaft of sun, and in that brightness every sewn flourish seems to ring like a silver bell. She gathers the skirt over one arm, ready at last to let hope descend the stair. Tomorrow arrives scented with rosewater and chime of distant carriages. Yet before anticipation can bloom, a rustle of taffeta storms the hallway. Her stepsisters, ribbons, sharp as remarks, sweep into the room, eyes catching the gown's new gleam. Admiration flickers an instant, then curdles. Words scratch the calm, accusations of theft and vanity. But it is the sudden clutch of jealous hands that draws the breath from the morning. Fingernails snag satin, bracelets snag lace. And with one wrench the bodice yields, threads snapping in small plaintive pops. The gown slumps, wounded yet silent, upon the floorboards. The commotion subsides as abruptly as it rose. Footsteps retreat, leaving only the echo of slammed doors and the faint scent of crushed lavender. Cinderella kneels, gathering the torn fabric into her lap, fingertips trembling yet gentle. She inhales, and the hurt settles like dusk across a meadow present, undeniable, but also finite. In the stillness that follows, a pigeon coos from the eaves, an almost imperceptible note of sympathy, and she allows that sound to steady her breathing, to remind her that ruin is rarely the final verse. Slowly she folds the damaged gown, aligning ripped seams with patient precision, as though setting bones that will one day mend. Loose, pearls spill like frozen dew across the plank floor. She collects each sphere, cupping them in her palm where they glow with quiet resolve. The attic's hush envelopes her again, neither condemning nor consoling, simply existing as night exists, ready to be traversed. She lays the gown within a woven basket, not out of resignation, but as an act of trust that waiting, too, can be a form of creation. Outside, evening gathers clouds the colour of hem-stitched violets, and one by one the first stars awaken, each pricking the sky with calm illumination. Somewhere beyond the orchards, a gentle figure stirs, drawn by sorrow's summons and hope's faint, persistent lantern. For now the attic sleeps, mice curled in cotton, feathers resting beside spools, and Cinderella's breathing evens as she leans against the window ledge, gaze lifted to the patient constellations. Their shimmer suggests that magic often arrives when the heart is quiet enough to hear its footfall, and such quiet, she realizes, is already settling in. Embers in the scullery cooled to a faint ruby glow as dusk withdrew beyond the window ledge, and so the tale moves from the hush of the hearth to the night-drawn garden where the breath of jasmine drifts in patient curls. Cinderella stepped between shadowed hedges, skirt still marked by ash, slippers thin from relentless labour, her heartbeat barely louder than the flutter of moth wings around a lantern that no one had bothered to light. The garden, once proud with trellised roses, now lay untended, yet night forgave every wilted leaf. Silver starlight poured over each petal so kindly that even bruised blossoms appeared newly born, and the weary girl, seeing this quiet mercy, felt tears gather before she gave them permission. They slipped down her cheeks like two clear beads, losing themselves in candle wax, and when the first droplet touched the earth and owlet hidden in a cypress answered, with a tremulous note, as though the night itself were echoing her sorrow back to her in gentler tones. She sank onto the cold stone edge of a fountain, the water long drained by indifferent hands, and stared at her reflection in the dark circle, seeing almost nothing, yet feeling everything longing, the unnamed wish that ought to belong to any breathing heart. A faint breeze coaxed Ivy to murmur along the brick walls, and within that nearly silent language she believed she heard her late mother humming a cradle tune, so tender that the ache inside her chest widened, then loosened, until sobs arrived like rain after oppressive heat. Night settled deeper, throwing handfuls of indigo across the sky, and for a breathless while her laments formed the only ripple in the stillness, but sorrow, like soil, may cradle seeds, and in the hush between two tears, a faint glimmer, pale as milk, gathered on the garden path. It drifted first as a wandering thread of light, uncertain where to alight, then coalesced into the quiet silhouette of a woman cloaked in the glow of remote moonbeams, her gown seeming woven from ripples of still pond water and the sighs of moths. Cinderella, astonished yet not afraid, brushed the back of her hand across damp cheeks, embarrassed that any stranger should meet her in such a state, but the newcomer's smile, soft and a little mischievous, broke the awkwardness before it could form. A moonlit garden is a terrible place for despair, the figure observed, voice featherlight yet edged with playful wisdom. Dust and shadows do not suit your complexion, my dear, though I must commend your dedication to grayscale fashion. Cinderella blinked, surprised into a fragile laugh that felt like sunlight pushing through thick curtains. Fashion, she managed, glancing at the soot-streaked apron tied above her patched skirt. I fear it is simply what remains after everything finer has been taken. The luminous woman drew closer, boots barely kissing the ground. Wherever she stepped, dew brightened and small blades of grass straightened, as though eager for inspection. Then perhaps we ought to reclaim what was borrowed without consent, she suggested, folding sleeves that were more radiance than fabric. Cinderella studied the stranger's eyes, noticing the calm dappling of moon on still water, and realized with startled gratitude that she stood before something beyond human naming, an emissary of kindness, a keeper of possibility, a fairy of maternal grace. Perhaps sensing the recognition, the woman dipped a playful curtsy. Titles are formal, she murmured, but if you must have one. Godmother suits me enough, provided you promise to curtsy back no more. Etiquette is exhausting, and this knight prefers ease. Warm amusement threaded through the garden, subtle as lavender, easing the stiffness in Cinderella's shoulders. She confessed her grief in quiet phrases, how the invitation to the royal ball lay crumpled on a kitchen shelf, how her stepmother's laughter had barred the door, how she had run here only to cry among weeds instead of waltzes. The godmother listened without interruption, nodding at intervals as if each sorrow were a bead she threaded onto a rosary of understanding. When the tale ended, she lifted one luminous eyebrow. I was under the impression that invitations are meant to be accepted, not hoarded like stale bread. She quipped, sending Cinderella into another small, surprised smile. But I have nothing to wear, the girl admitted, spreading the worn fabric of her dress as proof. And no carriage, and no shoes that could endure a single dance. The godmother regarded the ruined beds of vegetables beyond the fountain and snapped her fingers softly, as if summoning a memory rather than magic. There is a pumpkin of promising girth near the compost, she observed. Well-bred, round of chin, orange of cheek. I believe it aspires to an upgrade. They walked together among dewy rows until they found the pumpkin, its skin shining under starlight like lacquered sunset. The godmother tapped it with a silver-tipped wand that appeared, quite politely, from the sleeve of moonbeams, and the vegetable quivered, stretching into a barouche painted with morning frost and trimmed in twilight. 4 mice, who had paused their nightly exploration of breadcrumbs, squeaked in perplexity as the godmother regarded them like a tailor measuring cloth. One flourish of her wand swirled silvery dust around their whiskers, and they rose on hind paws, lengthening into coachmen clothed in livery, the colour of moonlit doves, still carrying a hint of rodent curiosity in their bright eyes. A grasshopper, dazzled by developments, leapt forward as though volunteering, but the godmother chuckled and waved it back toward its dewy stage, whispering that not every creature was destined for night wheels and palace lanterns. Even magic, she noted, must respect personal ambition. Turning to Cinderella, she measured the girl's slight frame, the soft curve of trembling fingers, the fatigue clinging like cobweb. Yes, she murmured, as if approving a blank canvas, silk for resilience, silver for mornings yet to come, and a shade of blue borrowed from first love. With a sweeping circle of the wand, ash and cotton unravelled, threads rising like tame fireflies, weaving themselves anew around Cinderella's form. The fabric settled as a gown whose hue shifted between twilight and dawn, embroidered with tiny constellations that seemed to breathe whenever she inhaled. Last, the godmother knelt, touching bare feet mottled by cold stone, condensed and clarified into slippers of pressed starlight, their surfaces smooth as water under windless skies and strong enough to bear the weight of every unspoken dream the girl might carry. Cinderella lifted one crystalline shoe, marveling at the way it refracted moonlight into soft prisms across her palms. Glass? She wondered aloud. Won't it break? Only if hope itself shatters, the godmother replied, eyes twinkling with a riddle she did not intend to solve tonight. Walk gently, believe firmly, and they will remain whole. The coachmen cleared their throats with earnest dignity, and the barouche door swung open, revealing cushions stuffed with dust-colored down. The scent inside was faintly of orchard blossoms, as though the carriage remembered its days rooted to earth and carried that memory like perfume. Cinderella turned to her benefactor, gratitude rising so swiftly she could hardly speak, but the godmother pressed a gentle finger to her wrist, sensing the pulse of possibility. Her expression sobered, though kindness remained. Midnight is a boundary, she cautioned. When 12 strokes are spoken, all borrowed beauty returns to its original story. Promise me you will heed the clock. Cinderella nodded, the luminous gown whispering consent with every small movement. Yet some quiet thread of worry pulled at her thoughts. How fast did hours run inside palace walls? Would music drown the chime? The godmother read the question in her eyes and shrugged lightly. Time counters at its own pace, but your heart will know when to listen. She tapped the carriage once, twice, thrice, and lanterns bloomed along its frame, mirroring the stars stitched upon the gown. The garden, once a quiet witness to tears, now beheld the mild pageantry of second chances, and for a moment everything paused, moths mid-flight, ivy mid-sigh, even the owlet, hushed in quiet benediction. The wheels set off with a low sigh along the pebbled path, bearing Cinderella toward gates that would open into the palace and into unimagined chapters of her own becoming. The godmother watched until the glow vanished behind cedar, then folded her hands, content yet thoughtful. A single petal drifted from an overripe rose, settling in the dry fountain basin, a quiet reminder that enchantments, like blossoms, are brief. The garden resumed its natural night, cradling only moonlight in a fading echo of wheels. Beyond the horizon, music was tuning pearl-bright strings, and candles were being coaxed alive in mirrored halls. Soon, lords and ladies would witness a stranger stepping from a mysterious carriage, her eyes luminous as dawn over snowfields. But for now, the night held its breath, and the clock, somewhere far off, began its patient count toward 12. The hushed shimmer that had hovered over the courtyard in the wake of glass slippers and spun silver satin slowly drifted into the night, like the last glow of day surrendering itself to dusk. From that fading glimmer, gentle hoofbeats emerged, muffled by dew-rich moss, carrying the newly transformed carriage away from the quiet garden where magic had finished its unassuming work. Nothing remained of hearth smoke or cinders, only soft anticipation breathing in rhythm with the steady roll of polished wheels. The forest soon gathered around the path, its ancient pines and beech trees leaning close as though curious about the late traveller. A filmy veil of mist floated between the trunks, drawn upward by the cool pulse of moonlight that filtered through overlapping leaves. Silver beams slid across the carriage roof, tracing delicate arcs, then spilled silently through the curtained window to illuminate Cinderella's calm profile. She sat quite still, hands folded in her lap, fingers resting lightly on the lapis ribbon that belted her gown, as if afraid that any sudden motion might scatter the fragile wonder still settling inside her chest. Outside, the night breathed in, measured hushes. Now and then, an owl unfastened a soft, elongated hoot, the sound lengthening into the distance before being absorbed by the damp undergrowth. Lanterns fastened to the carriage doors released a flame-brushed glow over a drift of fog, turning the vapour the colour of pale honey. Each time the horses slowed to navigate a bend, the lamps cast long fans of amber into the underbrush, revealing shy clusters of wild violet and star-white mushrooms. Nothing stirred except the gentle weight of dew sliding from fern to fern. Deeper in, the forest floor rose and fell in slow undulations. The road curled over low hills, scattered with rubble-smooth stones, then dipped into hollows filled with the breath of unseen streams. When the iron-clad wheels crossed a narrow bridge of weathered planks, water murmured underneath, repeating forgotten lullabies rehearsed since the first thaw of spring. The horses, draped in harnesses that glimmered like frost, offered only occasional snorts of contentment, as though they too appreciated the quiet benevolence of the journey. Within the carriage, Cinderella's gaze drifted from one window to the other, following the slide of moon-colored shadows along the upholstery. With every passing mile, she felt the familiar corners of her old life loosen their hold-suit-darkened hearthstones, echoing chores at dawn, her father's empty study. All of it receded like a shoreline as a boat glides into open water. Around her, velvet cushions sighed with the subtle rustle that only the finest weavers can coax from cloth. That secret sound seemed to say that the night, for once, belonged entirely to possibility. The path soon widened, edged now by pale green lawns, cropped short, as if trimmed by moonbeams themselves. Lantern posts appeared at measured intervals, each crown of glass guarding a steady flame that bowed politely as the carriage passed. Beyond them, marble nymphs stood half-clad in shadow by quiet fountains, their sculpted smiles beaded with droplets that shivered in the faintest breeze. And then, suddenly, yet without hurry, the palace revealed itself. First came the distant hum of music, a slow swell of violins unfurling through the air like silk freed from its spool. Next, high spires rose above the treetops, their gilded finials capturing starlight and returning it in soft flares. Between those towers stretched terraces of pale stone shaped in wide, embracing arcs, each balustrade traced by climbing night-blooming jasmine. Though the night was cool, the faint perfume of the blossoms drifted outward, meeting the descending mist in a tender, silent greeting. The carriage turned onto a drive of crushed white quartz. The stones sparkled faintly, echoing the scattered constellations overhead until it seemed as though earth and sky were nodding to each other in quiet recognition. At last, the vehicle came to a graceful halt before the grand staircase, where twin braziers exhaled slow spirals of cedar-rich smoke. A liveried footman stepped forward, cloak swirling like calm water about his boots, and opened the door with a movement so smooth it felt rehearsed by countless evenings of gentle ceremony. Cinderella accepted the offered hand. One tiny glass slipper touched the first stair. Cold marble greeted the translucent sole with a soft chime, barely louder than a breath. Her gown, the muted colour of dawn's most secret mist, rippled across the steps in pale folds, pearly highlights sliding like water over the fabric. Up and up she moved, bathed in a measured chorus of distant strings, until she reached polished doors inlaid with slender vines of mother-of-pearl. These doors parted at a silent cue, revealing a vestibule so wide the air itself seemed to expand. Light poured from chandeliers fashioned to mimic unfurling lilies. Each crystal petal held a candle that glowed steady and low, as though mindful of the tender hour. Pastries decorated the walls. Their threads dyed in hues only night could truly appreciate: deep plum, forest shadow, the gentle bruise of twilight clouds. Yet even their meticulous scenes seemed to hush themselves, conscious that the evening belonged to living stories rather than woven ones. Through an arched opening at the far end, Cinderella saw the ballroom. It resembled the tranquil surface of a lake at moonrise. Mirrored floorboards glimmered beneath a sheen of wax, and columns carved to resemble slender aspen trees formed delicate groves along the edges. Between those columns, courtiers drifted in low conversations that never rose above the hum of the orchestra. Fan feathers fluttered, silk sleeves brushed lightly against one another, pearls created tiny constellations on throats and wrists. The overall sound was less a bustle than a single, elongated sigh of marvel. Within this silvery tide of faces, two familiar ones bobbed near a table heaped with sugared fruits. The stepsisters, resplendent in fabrics whose vigorous hues seemed to petition the torches for attention, were studying the newcomers with bright, acquisitive eyes. They clutched painted masks upon slender sticks, emerald for one, topaz for the other. Yet even behind their chosen colours they betrayed a constant alertness, measuring and appraising. Tonight, however, their scrutiny remained fixed on glittering epaulettes, velvet gloves, and the possibility of being overheard by someone important had earlier swept ashes from their hemline. Cinderella paused under the arch while a herald announced arrivals in a voice melodious but subdued, like a flute playing at a distance. Her name, in deference to secrecy and enchantment, was not uttered. Instead, the orchestra sensed her presence in a ripple across the strings, shifting into a tender adagio that encouraged every conversation to soften further. The prince, standing near the musicians, turned as though guided by that very chord. Until this moment, he had greeted guests with courteous ease, bowing here, exchanging a remark there, moving through layers of formality as calmly as one might traverse garden paths. Yet when he saw the newcomer, whose eyes carried the muted shine of dawn's first star, the polite rhythm of his expression faltered, replaced by wonder that colored his face neither too bright nor too pale, but vividly awake. A gentle curiosity drew him forward, each footstep timed with the measured bowstrokes that filled the hall like a lingering tide. He stopped at a respectful distance, inclining his head in greeting rather than command. Cinderella responded in kind, her curtsy unfolding in serene slow motion, the edges of her skirts floating outward like petals settling over water. No rustle disturbed the gesture. Even air seemed to take care not to inconvenience the moment. When she rose, the orchestra eased into a gentle dance measure, one designed not to dazzle, but to invite. With a quiet question held only in his eyes, the prince extended a gloved hand. Cinderella, as though recognizing something familiar in that silent invitation, placed her fingers upon his with gravity rather than haste. The room's hush thickened, not with shock, but with anticipation as soft and inevitable as dawn. Stepsisters, mid-phrase, froze beside their brimming goblets, mouths parted in admiration at the elegant stranger's composure. If jealousy stirred, it remained dormant beneath layers of astonishment. The couple moved toward the center of the floor where a luminous circle had been coaxed alive by hidden mirrors overhead. There, amid a bouquet of light, the first dance began. It unfolded not in bold sweeps but in gentle arcs. A drifting waltz that favored pauses over pivots, silences over flourishes. Each step landed as lightly as a feather, each turn completed as carefully as if choreographed by clouds. The prince guided with unobtrusive refinement, while Cinderella responded with the calm certainty of a river knowing the pull of moon-drawn tides. Together they fashioned a pattern nearly imperceptible to the untrained eye, a slow bloom, a soft release, a hush, another bloom. Around them, watchers forgot the careful cadence of their own breath. One elderly duke rested both hands on the handle of an ivory cane, tears of unreasoned nostalgia brightening his gaze. A trio of young pages stood on tiptoe to glimpse the swirling tableau, their expressions smooth as wax in the candle glow. The stepsisters edged forward, fanning themselves too hard, cheeks mottled pink from the nearness of greatness, still unaware they were witnessing a hearth-kept secret in luminous garb. In the gentle rotations of the waltz, time loosened. Candle flames stretched taller, then folded again. The distant chiming of a courtyard clock floated in, not as a mandate, but as an almost forgotten reminder of measured hours. The orchestra layered soft clarinets beneath the violins, the timbre a velvet river, upon which each note drifted. Nothing pressed or hurried. Even wonder seemed willing to wait its turn. One pass brought the pair nearer the broad windows overlooking the palace gardens. Beyond the glass, moonlight scattered among sleeping roses, coaxing them to glow faintly, like resting embers piled under petals. Another slow turn carried them past a quartet of musicians who followed their movement with eyes half closed, bowing the strings as though reading the dance from an invisible page. Step by measured step, the prince and Cinderella traced a gentle infinity, weaving together present grace with half-remembered dreams. Then, seamlessly, the melody eased toward its final cadence, a drawn-out diminuendo sigh that settled over the ballroom, like a soft shawl. The prince guided Cinderella into the last poised stillness, their clasped hands lingering in the air before drifting apart. Applause remained unnecessary. Silence held more reverence. Only after several heartbeats did murmurs rise, fluttering like contented doves among the gathered guests. Still dazzled, the stepsisters exchanged quick, fervent speculations, each insisting that the newcomer must be a princess from a kingdom so far away, no one present could possibly dispute it. They catalogued the gem-like sheen of her gown, the otherworldly glass of her slippers, the gentle poise more felt than seen. Yet for all their scrutiny, recognition hovered just outside their grasp, kept at bay by disbelief and vanity's blindfold. Cinderella, meanwhile, allowed her hands to rest lightly against the folds of her dress, letting the hush of triumph slip quietly through her like warm wind across a calm lake. She dipped her head in gratitude to the orchestra, then to the prince, who answered with a smile untroubled by ceremony. Their shared silence spoke of questions meant for quieter corners and slower minutes, not for a hall brimming with soft-footed witnesses. Music resumed in a different key, inviting other couples forward. The prince offered Cinderella his arm, leading her toward a candlelit alcove where lemon trees in porcelain urns breathed gentle freshness into the room. Yet before conversation could blossom, A footman appeared with a silver tray of chilled cordial, and another requested the prince's counsel on a small matter of protocol. Duty parted them only by a few strides, but enough for Cinderella to notice the widening circle of interested faces drifting nearer. In that small pause, she caught sight of the palace gardens again. Beyond the doors lay terraces washed in delicate moonshine, stone benches frosted with luminescence, and distant hedges whispering beneath the steady hush of midnight fountains. A path lit by ground-level lanterns threaded away, promising stillness and perhaps the chance to breathe beneath an open sky. For now, though, the story remained indoors, steeped in murmured admiration. The night had not reached its peak, and magic, patient as ever, folded its wings for a brief rest. Far above, a tower clock began to consider its next announcement, its measured gears already turning in quiet secrecy. Soon enough, that measured chime would ripple through corridors and across the moonlit lawn, guiding the tale toward fresh twists. Yet in this moment, within walls scented by beeswax and jasmine, Cinderella simply inhaled the calm of being seen, truly seen, beneath chandeliers that glowed as though they never intended to extinguish. And somewhere in the hush between one violin phrase and the next, the night hinted that the gardens were waiting, their fountains poised to show reflections yet untold, when the next chapter's breeze would beckon. The final notes of the orchestra still shimmered in the vaulted ballroom air, when a small hush settled like falling lace, lingering over polished marble and lantern-lit shadows. Just moments earlier, laughter had glided between pillars and garlands, yet now a breathless expectancy hovered, born of a secret no one but a single girl in silver knew. She stood near the edge of the mirrored floor, heart gently fluttering from wonder rather than weariness, remembering how the last waltz had slowed to a sigh, how the candlelight had curved inside her glass slippers as though carrying starlight inside crystal. That fragile glow warmed her trembling fingers, but another memory surfaced, an older promise, spoken by a kindly enchantress, that midnight would invite all borrowed splendor to fold itself away again. Somewhere beyond velvet drapes the palace clock began its slow, implacable tolling, each resonant chime moving outward like a ripple across still water. The first strike felt polite, almost courteous, no harsher than the brush of silk against skin. The second metronomic note settled more deeply, threading through corridors, slipping beneath doors, finding the hidden hollows of tapestry and alcove. By the third, the air around the girl quivered, the candle flames dipping in solemn agreement, for they too kept time. She lifted her gaze toward the distant bell tower as though the stones themselves might rewind, but the fourth peal unfurled with calm conviction. The night was turning its own page, and enchantment, however softly given, was bound by that steady turning. A quiet decision bloomed inside her, neither panicked nor resigned, merely respectful of the promise she had made. She gathered the silvery folds of her gown, letting them slip through gloved hands like moonlit water, and stepped away from the polite circle of courtiers who still debated music and meteor showers. Her feet, though encased in glass, remained light. They skimmed the floor in a hush that felt akin to drifting snow. With every stride, another bell stroke unfurled, 5th, 6th, 7th, each one marking the thinning veil between marvel and memory. Portraits along the corridor seemed to lean closer as she passed, their gilded frames catching reflections of her shimmering departure, as though centuries of painted ancestors wished to escort her onward. The hall she entered next was narrower, its ceiling ribbed like the underside of a swan's wing, yet the walls glimmered with gilded stucco, delicate arabesque spiraling round niches of blue shadow. Here the clock's 8th chime sounded softer, dimmed by distance, but no less certain. She moved beneath chandeliers whose crystals whispered tiny rain-like songs each time her skirts brushed the air. In this hush of echo and ornament she allowed herself a lingering glance back, savouring what must soon be set aside, the kindness in the prince's eyes, the grace of the dance, the unasked question that trembled between them. Then the 9th chime blossomed, and she resumed, crossing thresholds, passing archways, always downward toward the grand staircase, gleaming ahead like a river of marble moonlight. A breath of cooler air rose from the stairwell, carrying faint garden scents, night blooming jasmine, damp ivy, newly watered rose beds. As she began her descent, the 10th chime rang in steady solemnity, its resonance causing a gentle shiver to travel along the balustrade. Step by measured step she floated, gown rippling in quiet billows that caught every lantern's glow. Midway, a subtle loosening brushed her heel. The fragile slipper, sleek and faithful until now, wavered. She paused, waiting the next moment with care, yet the 11th chime broke above, and the foot she lifted left the slipper resting on the polished tread behind her. No shattering followed, only a clear silvery hush, as though the stair itself held its breath to cradle the abandoned crystal. Far above, the great clock gathered breath for its final declaration. At that instant the prince reached the head of the stairs, alerted perhaps by some silent chord of instinct, rather than the clatter that never came. He saw the shimmer of her figure below, the story of haste whispered by trailing ribbons and unsettled light. His lips shaped her name, but the single syllable dissolved into dusk, for the 12th chime struck, deep as ocean midnight, washing away all nuance of speech. He began to descend, yet palace protocol guided loyal guards to intercept, raised palms, gentle but unyielding. They believed they served his safety. They could not know they parted him from a destiny, now slipping into shadowed porticos. The echo of his halted footstep lingered like a sigh. Below the grand stair, gilded doors opened of their own remembered momentum, allowing the young woman to drift into the moon-washed courtyard beyond. A single lantern swung there, casting slow arcs of honeyed luminance across cobblestones, and for one generous breath she felt the cool night steady her pulse. Crickets carried on with their delicate fiddling, indifferent to royal timepieces. She sensed the magic woven into her fleeting raiment begin to thin, threads of radiance unraveling like dawn mist, and so she moved again, more swiftly now though her footfalls remained featherlight. Past statues and fountains she glided, until the waiting carriage, still magnificent in its carved autumn gold, curved into view beneath skeletal vine-wrapped trellises, where moths circled in silent constellations. The coachman, mouse courtiers in livery spun from leaves, tipped his diminutive hat while unseen horses, once humble stable mice themselves, stamped the ground with hooves of illusion that hardly disturbed the dust. She lifted her gown's hem, accepted the coachman's tiny hand, and settled among velvet cushions that smelled faintly of harvest. As the door closed, the final reverberation of the 12th bell faded, leaving only the rhythmic hush of wheels beginning to turn. Down the slope they rolled, past iron gates wrought with roses, out into the country road where hedgerows bowed beneath the night breeze. Stars sashayed overhead like distant ballrooms of their own, and for a fleeting stretch of lanes the splendour held, obedient to the last soft echo of magic. But enchantment kept its covenant with time. First, the horses breathed out a sigh that became a squeak, their sleek manes flickered, resolving into whiskers and twitching noses. They leapt from harness to grass, scampering into hedge shadow as ordinary mice, leaving leather reins dangling like wilted vines. Next the carriage roof faded, brocade giving way to ridged pumpkin skin, orange deepening to russet under moonlight. Wheels shortened, sprouted curling stems, then came to a patient halt upon the rutted track. Silk cushions shrank into curling seed fibres, lanterns into dew-pearled tendrils. Within heartbeats the young woman knelt upon the road, surrounded by autumn earth and the low trill of crickets, the midnight silence accepting all transformation as calmly as the sea accepts returning tides. Moonbeams slid across her shoulders, replacing the formal shimmer of courtly fabric with the homespun blue of her everyday dress. She smoothed the simpler cloth without regret, for in spite of the coolness against her skin it felt honest, familiar, breathable like the breeze itself. A single glove remained, its mate somewhere within palace walls. She removed it gently and placed it beside the round ridged pumpkin, giving thanks for borrowed wonder and the chance to have danced at all. In the hush that followed, distant owls traded slow questions, while a brook unseen murmured its glassy commentary. She rose, bare feet meeting dusty ground, and began to walk, carrying with her only the memory of music, and the hopeful warmth the prince's eyes had kindled. Back at the palace, faint candlelight continued to swirl against the high windows of the staircase. The lone glass slipper, immaculate and luminously still, caught that glow and refracted it into quiet rainbows that pulsed along the marble. The prince knelt beside it, his brow touched by both wonder and perplexity, as though the slipper were a riddle offered by the night itself. Courtiers hovered a distance, uncertain whether to console or question. The guards who had stayed his pursuit now stepped aside in humbled silence. He lifted the delicate shoe with reverent hands, feeling its coolness, noting its impossible lightness, and within that fragile curve he heard, or imagined he heard, the faintest echo of vanishing footfalls, and the promise that some stories choose patience over haste. Far beyond lamps and laughter, the young woman walked a meandering path bordered by whispering wheat, the crisp night loosening into the gentler greys that herald dawn. Each step guided her nearer to the cottage hearth where embers would be waiting to stir again. In her thoughts the ball remained, not as splendour lost but as a soft melody in a shell held to the ear. Ahead, at a turn of the lane, a familiar willow leaned across the road, its branches swaying like slow-moving curtains. As she passed beneath, one last star slid down the sky, sketching a silver line that pointed toward horizons still unseen. The night, content with its turning, settled deeper, preparing the quiet canvas on which morning would write its next tender phrase. Night had scarcely withdrawn its velvet shawl from the castle towers when the slipper, still radiant from the candlelight that had cradled it in the ballroom, was lowered into a small casket lined with sky-coloured silk, the lid left ajar so the crystal might breathe. Around that hush of early morn, quill strokes danced over parchment, sealing a decree no subject could ignore, while messengers breathed slow plumes into the cold and rehearsed the single, shining sentence that would soon ripple through valley and village alike. By sunrise, the royal courtyard resembled a field of quiet banners. Soft-bellied horses, brushed to a moon-pale glimmer, stomped gently against cobblestones. Eager yet disciplined, trumpets were absent. Instead there drifted only the calm rustle of proclamations rolled and ribboned, passed from gloved palm to gloved palm. The mandate was simple. Every maiden, whether nestled in mountain hamlet, seaside hut, or forest dwelling, must try the slipper, for the prince would search no farther until the delicate shoe found its rightful home. Thus began a kingdom-wide pilgrimage of patient hoofbeats and muted wonder. Riders followed river mist that threaded through meadows. They wound beneath willow canopies, where dew still listened for birdsong, and they paused at crossroads scented with fresh bread and chimney smoke. Each village unfolded like a painted page, cottages with crimson roofs, water-wheels turning unhurriedly, children balanced on stone fences, eyes widening as the velvet chest was opened for their sisters, cousins, and neighbours. Laughter rose, then quieted, respect spiralling back to the slipper's fragile glint. In one orchard settlement a beekeeper's daughter, sticky with honey scent, giggled when the shoe stopped at her arch. In a highland town a shepherdess whispered a shy apology to her ewes for leaving them momentarily unattended. In a lakeside borough fishermen hummed lullabies while their daughters slid knitting needles behind ears and bent to test the fit. Nowhere was there ridicule, only gentle curiosity, as though the entire realm had decided, just for a span of days, to wrap itself in shared, hopeful dreaming, listening to the rumours gather like distant thunder. Her heart, walled with pride and prickling fear, measured possibilities with the precision of a jeweller counting stones. If the slipper reached her stepdaughter, the carefully stacked fortunes of her own offspring might topple. A single decision drifted across her mind swift, silent, irreversible. She would conceal Cinderella where no knock, no call, no candle could find her. The attic waited, dust dancing like dull gold in narrow shafts of late morning sun. Trunks of forgotten seasons leaned against beams. A sentinel rocking horse creaked whenever wind threaded through the rafters. Here Cinderella was led, softly yet firmly, the lock snapping behind her like the click of winter ice on pond edges. She turned a calm gaze to the small square window above the eaves, the sky beyond it pale and patient, and in that gaze flickered neither complaint nor despair, only the even glow of a heart practiced in endurance. She swept a patch of floor clear and settled amid the quiet relics-ragged costumes from long-ended galas, moth-nibbled tapestries showing stars no astronomer could name, a cracked mirror that kept only fragments of reflection. While her fingers traced the worn wood, memories of the ball drifted back, not in fevered flashes but as a lingering perfume. Candlelight shimmering like water, music that moved with the tide of her breath, the prince's mild eyes carrying steady recognition. Such recollection was balm, and it rested with her more gently than any featherbed. Beneath the eaves, however, life still coursed through small, whiskered bodies. The mice those velvet-pawed custodians of secret corridors had sensed the change at once. They gathered under an overturned teacup beside the kitchen hearth, whispering in rustles and squeaks, their tails drawing question marks upon the flagstones. Cinderella, their moon and muse, was locked away, and the world outside was searching for her. Resolve, that rare metal, glinted in every tiny eye. Plans unfolded with the slow certainty of petals, for even in tender tales strategy may bloom. A spool of thread became an anchor to lower themselves between floorboards. A poppy seed bun, pilfered earlier, was rationed for courage. Thimbles slipped over heads like modest helmets. They mapped the manor in murmured syllables. Pantry to corridor, corridor to stair, stair to landing where the attic key, heavy as destiny, dangled from the steely chatelaine clasped at Lady Tremaine's waist whenever she dozed by the drawing-room fire. Timing, they knew, would be the hush between one heartbeat and the next, and they waited for twilight to widen that space. When evening arrived, it tiptoed rose-violet, up the horizon, softening every edge. Within the manor, half-drawn draperies fluttered like reluctant sighs, and a mantel clock chimed 8 mellow notes. The grand household had wearied itself with speculation and settled into drowsy vigil. Even the stepsisters, earlier flutter with hopes of ruby-ringed futures, now sulked beneath face creams that smelled faintly of mint. The mice slipped from shadow to shadow, their passage accompanied only by the tender knock of thread spools rolled across floorboards as diversions for the prowling cat. In the drawing-room, lamplight pooled gently around Lady Tremaine's elbow. A dull romance novel slipped from her grasp, her chin tilting in sleep, and the chatelaine of keys glistened against her skirts. Up the brocade they climbed, paws finding purchase in discreet stitches. With a final concerted tug, they freed the attic key huge, iron, unimaginably cold, and rode its swing to the carpet below, landing within a hush of her slumbering sigh. Not a thread of sound betrayed them. Only the embers, shifting softly, took silent notice. Wind meandered through corridors scented with lavender polish as the mice ferried the key toward the attic stair, sometimes pushing, sometimes steering, while perched atop its ornate bow. Down a dim hall they ventured, passing portraits whose eyes seemed to blink but never judge, until they reached the narrow door that climbed into darkness. Here they paused, gathering the bravery that quivers yet does not crumble, and turned the lock. The bolt slid back like a breath released after holding too long. Above, a faint gasp answered them, tender as dawnlight. Cinderella stepped from the attic shadows, hair silvered by straw and moonbeam, hands clasped in wonder. She knelt beside the panting mice, gratitude shining quiet as rain on stone. There was no time for grand embraces. Still, the attic door, once a seal of despair, now stood ajar, and that small gap was wider than oceans. They guided her down the stair, her slippers muffled by thought-warm cloth, her pulse steady, for she sensed the realm beyond the manor changing like a tide at full moon drawing nearer, drawing shore. Far beyond the iron gates, torchlit riders were concluding another day's search. They had crossed wheat fields where fireflies danced, they had accepted warm cider from millers' wives, and though the slipper had graced many hopeful feet, it had settled on none. Now guided by charts and subtle rumours, they approached the region where a lonely manor kept watch among oaks. Lantern glow rippled across armour, yet their voices remained subdued, as though the very air counselled gentleness before the final turning of fate's key. Inside, Cinderella paused at a window overlooking the long moon-dusted lane. Somewhere along that ribbon of road, hoofbeats were muffled by soft soil, measured, inevitable. She felt neither urgency nor alarm, only a calm suspense like the hush between notes of a lullaby. Behind her, the mice rested in a ring of weary satisfaction. Below, the household dreamed unaware. Beyond, night folded its tranquility around every rooftop. All paths, it seemed, were drifting toward a quiet meeting, and the next soft chapter would decide what kindness awaited at dawn. Morning entered the once raucous household in a muted drift of grey pearl light, as though the dawn itself pressed a gentle finger to its own lips and asked the walls to keep last night's secrets. The ballroom's distant music, long vanished, still seemed to shimmer beneath the rafters of memory, and the faint scent of crushed rose petals lingered on the stairs, like a question no one dared answer aloud. Chapter 8 had concluded with that hush, a single glass slipper cradled in velvet, a prince determined to follow its gleam, and Cinderella spinning through moonlit corridors of thought, half waking, half dreaming. Now the hush lengthened into daybreak, poised on the edge of discovery. The Baroness's townhouse stirred too early for comfort. Maids scurried with broom, rag, and hushed speculation, while the kitchen clattered with pans prepared for an extravagant breakfast no one had the appetite to eat. Drusilla and Florinda, those restless pillars of vanity, replayed the royal ball in scattered fragments. How the chandeliers kissed their curls, how the trumpets surely announced each of their steps yet. Each fragment carried the same splintering conclusion. An unknown maiden had outshone them, and every corridor seemed to whisper her triumph. They could not see the soft figure kneeling in the scullery at that moment, coaxing fire from damp logs and letting her thoughts float above the smoke. Cinderella, suit dusted but bright as dawn within, tended embers with a serenity that neither envy nor fear could dim. The stillness bowed abruptly to hoofbeats. Outside the iron gate, a royal carriage rolled to a decorous halt, its wheels breathing mist from the chilled autumn ground. Escorted by guards in cobalt cloaks trimmed with silver braid, the herald of the court descended and unfurled a parchment whose wax seal glimmered crimson in the morning's first true beam of sunlight. Trumpets might have sounded, yet even their brass voices felt softened by the day's peculiar quiet. The notes rose, rippled, and drifted away like feathers. The Baroness, startled from her habitual composure, swept to the portal in a rustle of stiff silk, rehearsing smiles that seemed to crack at their corners. By decree of the crown, every maiden dwelling beneath that roof was to present herself for a fitting of the forgotten slipper. Rumour had woven through villages that the prince's heart would recognize the rightful wearer as surely as the glass would cradle the foot it had once encircled. While the Baroness offered crisp curtsies, her thoughts started after ambition, calculating odds, rehearsing excuses, arranging compliments, each notion sharper than the last. She ushered the dignified party into the drawing-room heavy with tapestries, instructed servants to polish silver trays, and commanded her daughters to descend with haste, grace, and whatever remained of their dignity. Drusilla arrived first, swathed in ribbons of bitter lilac. She aimed for languid poise, though the staircase caught in her skirts and tugged one satin bow askew. Florinda followed, cheeks aglow with misplaced confidence, carrying a laugh too loud for the room's new stillness. The guards exchanged discreet glances, sympathy mingled with restrained amusement. A footman revealed the slipper atop a pillow of twilight blue velvet. Light travelled through the crystal curves until every facet shimmered like a captured sigh. One by one, the sisters lowered themselves to the chaise, extended a foot, and attempted to slide into Destiny. Destiny resisted. Drusilla's toes found no shelter. The heel barked. The arch refused. She pressed, pouted, pleaded, and only managed to redden her instep. Florinda fared little better, though she insisted the shoe was simply chilled from the night air, needing a moment to loosen. She wiggled, wedged, and whimpered, producing such a string of comic contortions that even the herald's solemn moustache quivered with the effort not to smile. The Baroness coughed to reclaim decorum, yet the slipper gleamed untouched, content in its certainty. A hush, deeper than any before, settled upon the drawing-room. The ticking clock stretched each second into silken thread. The herald cleared his throat, prepared to conclude formalities, but an inquisitive guard, perhaps guided by quiet intuition, posed a courteous question: were there other maidens in residence? The Baroness, momentarily unmoored, offered a delicate laugh that frayed at the edges. She spoke of distant cousins and travelling wards, none currently present. Yet before she could reshape the tale, a small, accidental sound betrayed her. A broom falling in the corridor, a startled gasp, and the swift whisper of slippered feet retreating toward the attic stair. Eyes followed the noise, and truth peeled back a corner of its veil. When guards moved to investigate, the Baroness's composure shattered into panic. Recovering, she swept ahead of them, reached the attic door, and, with a sigh sharp as a closing blade, turned the key in its iron lock. Behind that panel of weather-stained oak, Cinderella stood amazed by her own bold heartbeat. She had not intended to watch, only to be sure no candlestick wobbled, no tray upended. Yet curiosity drew her like tide toward moon, and now the latch confirmed her captivity. Dust, motes drifted through the attic's slanted light, swirling about trunks, ribbons, and forgotten toys. Cinderella pressed her ear to the door. Voices blurred by distance argued, insisted, dissolved into footsteps. Hope seemed once again something she must coax from ashes. Then, very softly came the scrape of another key. The younger footman who had carried the velvet pillow had lingered on the landing. He knew the look of locked doors that should never be locked. With a sympathetic tilt of his head, he turned the spare key left long ago in a silent cupboard, opened the way, and beckoned. She stepped from shadows into starlight, unremarkable in grey homespun, yet grace accompanied her as fragrance accompanies a flower. The footman guided her toward the drawing-room, though anxiety tugged at every breath she took. In that broad doorway she paused soot streaks on her sleeves, hair escaping its braid, and the hush inside the room deepened until it became almost music. Guards straightened. Drusilla and Florinda blinked as though mirrors had suddenly contradicted them. Cinderella's eyes lowered. She did not seek triumph. She merely recognized her moment and stepped forward. The herald, catching the quiet certainty that hovered around her like candle glow, gestured to the cushions. Without hesitation, Cinderella slipped off her worn shoe, set her foot upon velvet, and allowed the crystal slipper to settle across heel and toe as naturally as dawn meets horizon. No strain, no delay, a single, perfect fit. Light blossomed inside the glass, refracted into a slender rainbow that danced across the tapestries, painting lilies over dragons, mornings over storms. The room released a collective breath it did not know it held. Revelation travelled through every gaze, yet none felt it more sharply than the Baroness. Her ambitions, which had climbed like ivy around her heart, loosened their grip, and fell in brittle tatters. She beheld, perhaps for the first time, the quiet radiance she had tried to bury beneath cinders. Drusilla's irritation dissolved into baffled admiration. Florinda's mouth shaped an apology even before words arrived. Cinderella, foot still cradled by destiny's glass, raised her eyes with a softness undiminished by sorrow. She spoke no accusation, only a gentle greeting, as though the past were a tangled ribbon she chose to untie rather than tear. The herald took a courteous step back and bowed. He presented a second slipper, twin to the first, and Cinderella accepted it with fingers that trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer wonder of holding a dream made solid. She placed it beside its sister shoe, and there she stood, balanced between what had been and what might yet be. The footman who had freed her, modest and smiling, lifted the velvet pillow as though it carried starlight, ready to escort her toward the carriage waiting beyond the gate. Yet before she followed, Cinderella turned to the Baroness and her daughters. In the stillness, remorse blossomed among them like a pale, uncertain rose. The sisters, humbled, knelt in their taffeta and trimmings. They uttered broken phrases, clumsy, heartfelt, about jealousy, blindness, and the ache of realizing too late how kindness had stood beside them all along. The Baroness, voice fragile, asked forgiveness not once, but again, as though repetition might sow the rift. Cinderella listened with eyes luminous and calm. She spoke of pain, yes, yet also of nights around the hearth, of shared lullabies remembered from childhood before grief hardened into pride. Forgiveness, she said softly, was not a gate but a path. They could begin that walk whenever they dared. Tears glittered unsparingly, some born of shame, others of relief. No parade of victory marched through the chamber. Instead, a quieter triumph unfurled, the surrender of vanity, the surrender of resentment, the simple, weightless peace of letting go. When Cinderella finally stepped toward the waiting guards, she did so with her family at her side, their heads bowed, their hearts perhaps for the first time open to the possibility of change. She touched her stepmother's hand, then her sister's, leaving in that gentle contact a vow that kindness would not be withdrawn with distance. Through the corridors they progressed, past portraits of ancestors stern and splendid, past mirrors that no longer held the household's favor and thrall. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as if blessing each footfall. Servants paused their polishing to watch. Some smiled knowingly, others wiped furtive tears with linen corners. At the door, the coachman descended, opened the carriage, and extended a gloved hand. Crystal slippers met the carriage step with melodic taps, each one a soft punctuation mark in the long sentence of her journey. The gates swung wide, and the procession set off along the tree-lined avenue where leaves spun gold and amber across the road. Within the carriage, Cinderella gazed back once, saw the Baroness and her daughters standing together beneath the arch, arms entwined, shadows mingling, no longer silhouettes of discord, but a single shape of reconciliation poised to begin anew. The prince awaited at the palace with hopes higher than the tower's slender spires, yet he could not imagine how fully hope was already answering him. Behind the carriage, the sound of wheels merged with the hush of late morning. Above, a heron traced deliberate circles, patient as time itself. The story drifted forward, unhurried, bearing its characters toward ceremonies, promises, and gently unfolding tomorrows. For now, peace lay across the Shire landscape like a downy quilt, smoothing every field, every stream, every turning page, and somewhere beyond the next bend, in Chapter 10, the bells of new beginnings waited to stir the air with measured, tender song. Dawn had scarcely painted the highest spires of the palace with rose gold when the hush that closed the previous night still lingered, settling over polished corridors like a satin veil. In the lantern-lit ballroom, the last echo of violins rested within folded drapes, and on the terrace the final lantern swung lazily in the shy breeze, remembering the hush of midnight. It was from this soft pause that the new morning gathered itself, preparing to unfurl blossoms and promises in equal measure. The kingdom's people, roused not by trumpets, but by the murmur of doves, sensed that a gentle day awaited. Spring had arrived at last, not in spectacular bursts, but in patient threads of colour embroidered across meadow and moat. Pear blossom petals drifted like tiny boats upon the moat's mirrored surface, while the orchard beyond the walls whispered in pale and perfumed tongues. Gardeners moved quietly between rose canes, exchanging nods rather than speech, so that no sound might jar the delicate promise of the hour. Even the horses in the royal stables stamped only once or twice, mindful of the tempered hush that cloaked every courtyard stone. This would be the day of vows, but first, there would be stillness. For Cinderella, now addressed as Princess Ella, by those who spoke with shy reverence, the hours before sunrise had been spent beside an open casement, mending for she could not abandon the soothing rhythm of needle and thread. A tiny rip in the page's sleeve, discovered after the rehearsal feast, had called to her quieter instincts, and so she stitched by candlelight until the seam lay smooth again. The simple task steadied her breathing far more than jewels could. When she finally rose, she placed the needle into its velvet cushion, whispered gratitude to the little labour, and stepped into dawning light. In far wings of the palace, attendants floated through chambers whose high windows admitted pale ribbons of sunshine. They laced gowns of dew-green silk for guests who would stand among the blossom arches, polish silver goblets until they mirrored the latticed ceiling, and arrange garlands of wisteria that draped over every railing like waterfalls slowed to a thoughtful trickle. Yet even these preparations unfolded at the pace of a lullaby. Nobody hurried, for the kingdom had learned, through the story of the girl who once slept beside cinders, that haste can cloud the heart's perspective. Today, serenity itself was honoured. Across a small courtyard, in a suite granted for the occasion, Lady Tremaine and her daughters inclined, before a single mirror, their expressions uncharacteristically subdued. They wore gowns of pale hydrangea blue, colours chosen by Cinderella herself when she had sent a quiet invitation weeks earlier. No flourish distinguished their attire from that of other guests, and somehow this ordinary elegance weighed more heavily than gold. Drizella fingered a lace cuff she had not earned. Anastasia traced the curve of a hairpin she had not bought. Their mother, once sharpened by pride, now seemed carved from candle wax, softened and uncertain. They recalled, each in a private hush, the winter day when a soot-streaked servant had smiled through every unkind command, accepting slight upon slight with patient eyes. Shame, like a cool stream, had since flowed over those memories, washing away bristles of defensiveness and revealing the raw stone beneath. Lady Tremaine wondered how forgiveness could be real when unworthiness still gnawed. Yet the invitation had come, handwritten in looping lilac ink. "Come share with me the new beginning we once denied each other." The words were a door left ajar, and the mere fact of it changed the corridors of their hearts. When the sun finally settled above the palace garden, soft bells rather than trumpets drifted across the lawns. Guests followed the sound through columns draped in ivy, until they reached a clearing where white chairs curved like petals around a modest flower-woven arch. There, the prince waited with hands folded, his posture more humble than regal, as though he too understood the quiet contract of the day. When Cinderella appeared at the garden gate, light seemed to pause on her shoulders, not dazzling, but calmly luminous, as if acknowledging a soul already brightened by service. The vows they spoke were spare as river stones, polished by sincerity. Each promised not splendour but steadfastness, not perfection but patience, not dominion but dialogue. The arching willow near the fountain leaned inward, its leaves tremoring in the mild breeze, as though the tree too wished to eavesdrop on devotion that expected nothing in return. When rings were exchanged, simple circlets hammered by a village smith, the prince bowed his head while Cinderella kept her gaze steady, granting courage in the shape of a smile. A murmur, softer than applause, rippled through the gathering, then drifted skyward and vanished into blue. After the officiant proclaimed the union, Cinderella turned, not first to the cheering nobles, but toward the row where her stepmother and stepsisters sat. She carried neither bitterness nor triumph in her expression, only a gentle beckoning. A single chair, placed deliberately between the couple and the crowd, remained empty. Without words, she invited them to rise and occupy this space of honor. The pause felt longer than a season, yet it lasted no more than a breath before Lady Tremaine stood, knees trembling like saplings, and moved forward. Drizella and Anastasia followed, hands clasped together as though rehearsing courage. Upon reaching the vacant chair, Lady Tremaine faltered, uncertain whether to sit or to kneel in apology. Cinderella gently placed a hand over hers, guiding her into the seat, but bending herself so that their eyes were level. No formal pardon passed between them. Only the quiet mingling of two breaths, once separated by pride and poverty, now sharing the same gentle wind. Drizella whispered a promise to mend every discarded gown she had once mocked. Anastasia vowed to water the palace gardens through summer. Small vows, but genuine. And in that moment, Cinderella's story slipped, almost imperceptibly, into theirs. Throughout the kingdom, the celebration unfurled like the fragrance of lilac on warm air, subtle yet everywhere. Village bakers placed extra loaves upon windowsills, inviting passers-by to share without payment. Shepherds wove ribbons into their flock's wool, and watched children laugh at the bright parade of ewes. A travelling minstrel, having heard of the new princess's kindness, composed a ballad that spoke not of palaces but of hearth fires kept alive by hope. And as he sang in market squares, strangers found themselves smiling at one another with the easy familiarity of neighbours. Such was the nature of compassion, contagious, quiet, complete. In the palace library later that evening, Cinderella sought a moment of solitude among shelves that smelled of parchment and cedar. The day's music had given way to crickets, and the lanterns burned low, their flames nodding slowly like scholars half asleep. She opened the journal that had once held her stepmother's strict household accounts, and on a clean page inscribed 3 words: humility, courage, resilience. Beneath each she wrote a single memory sweeping ashes. Without bitterness, stepping into the moonlit coach despite fear, and rising after every cruel decree with her heart still whole, she closed the book, satisfied that these riches could neither tarnish nor be taxed. Outside, the festival gently waned. Lanterns floated upon the river like amber stars, drifting toward the sea. Old women hummed cradle tunes from open doorways, and the smell of warm milk drifted through alleys. In the great hall, the prince coaxed a lullaby from a reed whistle, its notes echoing softly up the spiral stair where Cinderella now descended. Together they crossed the courtyard to the hearth that still glowed in the scullery aunts, her only kingdom, now a place of chosen remembrance. They placed no logs upon the fire, allowing it to mellow into embers the colour of a pocket dusk. Long after the wedding guests sought their chambers, small acts of courtesy still glimmered through the corridors. A page returned a misplaced ribbon to the laundress who had dropped it, and she, in turn, covered a dozing guard with her shawl. These tiny mercies, strung together like quiet beads of light, formed the necklace by which the castle would remember this night. Not for grandeur, but for goodness shared without witness. They sat side by side on the worn bench, whose wood still bore faint scorch marks from hurried winter cook fires. Above the mantel hung the first slipper, no longer glass, but leather, patched by the royal cobbler so that it might carry stories rather than break. Cinderella rested her head upon the prince's shoulder, and silence unfolded between them, roomy and restful. In that hush she felt the kingdom breathing, from castle tower to shepherd's gate, each life rocking gently towards sleep. And now, gentle listener, may the calm of their hearth settle around you as well, warming your thoughts like soft embers. Let the story close its book, the pages sighing in contentment, while night drapes its velvet curtain across your sky. All is kindly tended. All is quietly well. Good night.